All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our class. My name is Jenna Wood, and I am a dietitian here with the Giant Company. February, as you probably know, is Heart Health Month. And so for our Wellbeing Connection classes, we are talking about nutrition as it relates to specific, heart conditions or lab values. So tonight we're going to cover cholesterol, and make sure you tune in. We'll also talk about blood pressure in a couple weeks. Or it might be next week. But as I mentioned, tonight we are touching on eating to lower cholesterol. Buckle up. Tonight is definitely a little different than some of our other classes where we focus more on recipes and foods. We're going to talk about cholesterol more than you ever wanted to know or thought you should know. But I want to give you as many practical tips and things that maybe you can change in your diet to see if that helps, because for some people, dietary approaches might not work, but we want to give it our best shot, right? So let us get into cholesterol. So our overview for tonight, we are going to just briefly touch on what is cholesterol to kind of set the baseline for that. Then knowing your numbers, what are the recommended lab values for the various types of cholesterol? And then, of course, as a dietitian, we're going to touch on some dietary approaches for cholesterol management, foods and parts of foods to maybe increase, some to decrease, and ones maybe you've never even heard of being related to cholesterol. So let's get into it. So first, what is cholesterol? So cholesterol is a waxy fat-like substance that we find in our blood, and therefore we can get, lab values done on our serum cholesterol. And that's an important distinction. I'll often kind of talk about blood or serum cholesterol and then dietary, because they are different. Now, our livers are so fascinating. They do so many things, but they actually create all the cholesterol you technically need. And it is essential for health. So, it's not to say that we don't need cholesterol. We definitely do. It is important for the formation of cells. Every cell in your body has cholesterol. We have this like lipid layer around our cells. We need cholesterol. It's important for vitamins and for hormone production. So it is essential. And that's why we produce it. We actually produce all that we need in our liver. And that's kind of where things get a little tricky. Too much cholesterol in our blood can be a problem long term. You may see in the news, you may see on social media that our cholesterol levels don't matter. And I don't know who started that myth, but really they are. And for most people, having high cholesterol levels long term can really lead to a lot of issues. It can, various types of cholesterols can attach to our artery walls and form plaques, and these plaques can cause inflammation. And if they break off, they can lead to things like heart attacks and stroke. So high cholesterol long-term, definitely not a positive thing. Now, cholesterol in our bloodstream can be produced from the foods we consume, from other lifestyle factors, and our livers, again, do produce it. And for some people, your liver might be producing too much. And there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do for that part unless you take medication. So we'll touch on some of that. But just to kind of showcase, we do produce our own, and that's why it's not necessarily essential in our diets. Now, what are the different types of cholesterol? First, you've probably heard of LDL, or what we kind of call the lousy cholesterol. This is the one we really want to kind of watch out for. We want this to be as low as possible. There isn't really any parameters to say about it being too low. There are some people where that's been a case, but very, very rarely. So this is one we want to reduce our levels of. Then we have the HDL. This is considered, if we think H for healthy or happy, HDL cholesterol kind of functions to remove some of that bad cholesterol. So it kind of works as a scavenger in our bloodstream to take those bad cholesterols and bring them back to the liver to kind of be disposed of. So that's why you may hear of it as being, heart healthy or cardioprotective. Then we have triglycerides. These are technically not cholesterol, but you will often see it on a lipid panel. This is a stored form of energy, of fat in our bloodstream, and it's typically a negative when it's too high as well. Other tests you may see when you get a lipid panel done could be total cholesterol. So this is a formulation or a calculation of your LDL plus your HDL, and then 20% of your triglycerides. I don't know why it's that, but apparently that's what it is. So you'll see a total number. Non-HDL is everything else that's not HDL. So that's pretty, easy to kind of consider. But basically, there are other types of cholesterol. So we kind of break it down easily into LDL and HDL for just layman's terms, but there are other types. There's chylomicrons, which is one of my favorite words, very low density lipoproteins, which is another type, and they're all negative forms of cholesterol. So if your non-HDL is particularly high, that would be a negative sign. Your ratio, so this shows you how much total cholesterol over your HDL. Your ratio, and I'll show you like what the actual ranges are in a second, but we want that to be a lower number. We don't want, that's because we know that HDL can be cardioprotective. So we want that HDL to be on the higher side to reduce that ratio. And then there are other types of lipids that we're starting to track, things like ApoB and lipoprotein A. These are typically for people who may have that familial hypercholesterolemia, who have a strong genetic predisposition for high cholesterol. Sometimes they're starting to check that. And if that number's high, that's showing all of the types of cholesterol that is damaging for our blood vessels. So basically kind of like a non-HDL as well. This is a kind of a nice chart from Abbott that shows the optimal ranges, intermediate or elevated, and then really high levels. So for total cholesterol, the way I kind of try to remember it, and you will see different numbers depending on who you look at. Now that I'm looking at this, I realize for total cholesterol, we want it to be under 200. That is the recommendation. For LDL, the recommendation here you'll see 130. Some others you'll typically see 100 is the recommendation for heart health and protection. For HDL, the recommendation is greater than 60. And actually, you'll see different recommendations for men and women. Women tend to have a slightly higher level anyway because of our estrogen levels, but greater than 60 is the recommendation for most people, adults anyway. Triglycerides, we recommend them being under 150. So I always try to remember 200 for total, 100 typically for LDL, and then under 150 for triglycerides. And then, of course, HDL, we want it to kind of be as high as we possibly can. Then you see that non-HDL number. We want that to be under 130 if possible. So kind of similar to the LDL number. And then the total cholesterol HDL ratio, this recommends lower than 3. I've seen some that say under 3.5, kind of varies. But again, the lower the number, it tends to be better for your ratio as well. I know this is a lot. Of course, I will send the slides, but that's just the background. We want to focus on what can we do to change these numbers. Now, what can raise cholesterol? Of course, there are going to be people who genetically, they're just going to have high cholesterol. They could eat the most perfect diet in the world, and their livers are just overproducing. You can't really do a whole lot to change that except for medications. So if you are really trying, you might still need some extra help, and that is okay. That's why we have medications. Now, of course, there are unhealthy eating habits that will raise cholesterol, and we'll touch on them. Physical inactivity, so not being physically active, can raise your cholesterol levels, and it can also raise your triglyceride levels as well. Physical activity is one of the ways to actually increase your HDL as well. There aren't a whole lot of ways to do that, so that is one. Carrying excess adipose or fat tissue, especially around the abdomen. If you think about where your liver is, we don't want a lot of excess fat there. That can lead to higher cholesterol, and it can make our livers not function properly too. Tobacco use and exposure to secondhand smoke, and alcohol intake, excessive intakes of added sugars, low omega-3 intake, so those fatty fishes and nuts and seeds, and consuming more calories than we need every day can be linked to high triglycerides as well. So lots of things we can consider when it comes to dietary, but also lifestyle factors with cholesterol. And I know that's a lot of stuff, and I don't want you to be overwhelmed. So at the end, we're going to talk about some practical, just baby steps that we can make to start to reduce our numbers. The good news, Many studies show that up to a 30 to 40% reduction in cholesterol can come about from nutrition and lifestyle factors alone. Again, kind of separate from those people who really need medication as well. And of course, some people do need that medication, but we want to still do those lifestyle factors and dietary changes because they're good for a whole host of reasons. Now, what are the specific foods or food groups that may help lower cholesterol? So, the first that can help, we have soluble fiber. So, I'll touch on those: soy protein, plant sterols and stanols. You may have never heard of those, so that's why I'm going to talk about them. And then things that can hinder our cholesterol include saturated and trans fats, maybe coffee. So, I'm going to touch on that, and sugar, as I kind of alluded to with triglycerides. Now, I included this graphic, and there's a link to the study that this graphic was in, but I thought it was just so fascinating to show. And I'm sure my picture is obscuring the top one that I think is the most interesting because it says unfiltered coffee. But the bigger circles and the more thick the circle is, the more studies we had to showcase if it helped lower or raise cholesterol levels. So you see, like, unfiltered coffee, solid fats. So solid fats are going to be those that are solid at room temperature, like butter and, fats and meats and different things like that. The middle line actually just kind of showed it didn't really help or hinder things like filtered coffee or fish. Fish and those omega-3s, we know it's good for triglycerides, but not necessarily LDL cholesterol, which is what this graphic was showing. Things like tomatoes, almonds, flax seeds, soy, soluble fiber, like we're going to touch on a lot of these, all had a lot of great research to prove that they really can help reduce your cholesterol. So those are the ones I'm going to focus on today. But I thought this was a nice graphic to see, like, okay, what foods can I start including more in my diet if reducing my cholesterol is a goal? Our first is soluble fiber. I know you probably hear our dietitian team talk about fiber because we love talking about it, but it really is so crucial for so many health implications, especially cholesterol. And for cholesterol, we're more so thinking about the soluble fiber because there are other types like insoluble and all these other types. Now, how does that work? How does soluble fiber reduce our cholesterol? So it works by binding with bile acids in our intestines. Bile or bile acids are made of cholesterol. We make them in our liver. And that's where cholesterol is being made anyway. And we need bile to digest fats and different things, but it has cholesterol in it. So if soluble fiber kind of works like glue with that cholesterol, it can help eliminate the bile, eliminate the cholesterol. And then the liver will have to take cholesterol out of our blood to make more bile. So it's kind of helping work, kind of like HDL does, as a filter to remove some of that cholesterol. So I think of all of the dietary approaches and things you can do, I think increasing your soluble fiber intake is probably one of the best. The recommendation is 5 to 10 grams of soluble fiber per day. The total recommendation of total fiber per day is like 25 to 38. So, it's hard because not a lot of food packages will tell you how much is soluble. So if you're hitting that daily target, you tend to be hitting the soluble. It's found in things like oatmeal, oat bran, barley, beans, nuts, and seeds, tons of fruits and vegetables with the peel or the skin. You want to eat the whole thing as opposed to juice. And then some supplements. Of course, you want to check with your doctor or your pharmacist before adding a supplement because things like psyllium supplements can inhibit the absorption of some medications, and they're not for everyone. Our next one is soy protein, which I'm sure some people turn their noses up to. However, it really had a lot of research behind it. Now, how does it work? So soy protein helps slow the production of cholesterol in the liver, and it speeds up the rate in which the liver is removing cholesterol from our blood. Studies were showing about 25 grams of soy protein per day helped lower cholesterol LDL by 3 to 4%. So it is a small reduction, but when combined with other dietary approaches, it can make a big difference. I think if your LDL was around 150, which is high, it can reduce it by about 6 points. So it's nothing to, laugh at or anything. So, but 25 grams of soy protein is probably a lot for most people. And additionally, soy is also beneficial for our heart health and other reasons. So it's low in saturated fat. It's a good source of protein. It has isoflavones, which are a phytonutrient, fiber, omega-3s. So a lot of great reasons to have it in place of some animal or saturated fats anyway. We get it in foods like soy milk. So that's an easy swap there. Tofu or tempeh. So, if you want to try, we have tons of great recipes. Edamame, whether it's fresh, frozen, or dried. And then texturized vegetable protein is kind of a dried product that you can use in place of different ground meats. I really like experimenting with it. Our next one is plant stanols and sterols. These are called phytosterols. So sterol, you probably notice, is the same end part of the word of cholesterol, but phyto is plant. So these are kind of the cholesterol of plants, but cholesterol is, as you know, as I've said a million times, cholesterol is made in our liver. Plants don't have livers, but animals do, which is why animal foods also have cholesterol, but plants don't. They have these different form. And what's nice is these phytosterols mimic cholesterol in how they look and how they function. So their, cell structure is similar. So our body kind of is competing with it as we're absorbing it. So it's going to absorb those phytosterols and not the cholesterol. And that's a really good thing. The excess cholesterol is then removed as waste. Current guidelines recommend about 2 grams of phytosterols per day, and that can reduce LDL cholesterol by about 5 to 10% when combined with some other lifestyles and dietary changes as well. Now, this one's a little tricky because it is difficult to get in foods, but it is found in small amounts in all fruits and vegetables, beans, especially soy, so another reason for soy, and whole peas, whole grains, not especially, wheat germ is technically not a whole grain because it's just the germ, but you'll find a lot of plant sterols there. Nuts, especially pistachios, unrefined vegetable oils, so things like olive oils, but also there were like sesame oils, which is a seed, but there are tons of different plant-based oils that have phytosterols. And then there are more and more foods that are being fortified with these phytosterols. You may be familiar with Benecol. I linked it here onto to Giant. I can link it to Martin's as well. But that is like a butter spread alternative that has plant sterols in it. I think it has like 900 milligrams per serving. So you're getting close to that 2 grams. And then supplements. So there is one, at least from Nature Made, called Cholestoff, which has phytosterols in it. I will say it doesn't always agree with everyone's GI system from what I've read from, reviews, because it is removing some of that cholesterol as waste, cause some GI side effects like, diarrhea, bloating, different things like that. And it is a supplement. So it still would talk to your doctor or pharmacist before adding it to your diet or your routine. But it is another option, and there have been some good studies about supplementation with phytosterols. But again, I think the main call out here is just trying to eat more plant-based foods. I'm not saying you have to be vegan or vegetarian even, but the more plants we can be consuming, the better it is for our cholesterol. Now, what about foods or ingredients or parts of foods that aren't so great for cholesterol? I mentioned fiber being like the thing you want to do and add more of to help reduce your cholesterol. I would second that with reducing our intake of saturated fats. And I'll touch on cholesterol that we get from foods on another slide, but saturated fat is really the component of foods that will increase our production of cholesterol in our bodies. So eating foods with saturated or trans fats can cause your body to produce even more LDL. So you got your liver producing whatever it's producing, and then saturated fats are just going to up that production even higher. Now, there are some people who are hyper responders and their bodies will produce tons compared to other people. So that's why you may see some people who follow some of these super high fat diets and their LDL is beautiful. And then you'll see somebody else try it and their LDL spikes to 900. We're all very different people. So there are some nuances with some of this, of course. Now, the American Heart Association recommends limiting our saturated fat intake to less than 6% of our total calories. So, of course, you're going to need to know kind of what you need for calories per day. And of course, we should be completely avoiding trans fats. Now, trans fats were removed from our food system back in like 2018, I want to say, but there are some that are naturally occurring, and we can produce some as well. So I'll touch on that in the next bullet point. But by reducing your saturated fat intake to that less than 6%, you may be able to reduce your LDL cholesterol by 8 to 10%, which is a significant amount for sure. And then considering maybe all of the others that you can do by adding fiber and all that great stuff. As an example, for 6%, for a 2,000 calorie diet, that's about 11 to 13 grams of saturated fat. It's not a lot. It doesn't go very far, but it's one of many things. And if you're somebody who's eating a ton right now and your cholesterol is very high, slowly reducing that number can be beneficial too. And then maybe aiming for most days to be in that 11 to 13 gram range. And of course, the recommendation is to replace those saturated fats with unsaturated fats. So if a saturated fat is from an animal or from, is solid at room temperature like butter, we tend to recommend replacing most of it. I'm not going to tell you you can't have your butter on your toast or whatever it happens to be, but if the majority of the oils we're using are unsaturated, like olive or avocado oil, it is a better swap for cholesterol. Now, saturated and trans fats, saturated is what I focus mostly on, but we're going to find them in fatty cuts of meat. Anytime you see fat, so marbling or skin that's on the poultry, that's going to be high in saturated fat. Butter, ghee, cream, full-fat cheeses. There is some research out there that says that high-fat dairy is not as negative for our cholesterol as we once thought. It's very difficult to study nutrition research because we don't eat nutrients in isolation. We eat whole foods and lots of them. So, but they're starting to see that maybe dairy is not as big of a problem in whole dairy. So like yogurt, milk, things like that, possibly cheese. But of course, things like shortening, margarine, coconut, and palm oil. And then of course, fried foods, baked goods, pastries, pie crusts. And then I just kind of listed them here. If you see the words partially hydrogenated oil on a package, that is a trans fat. Again, they were banned from our food supply, so you should never see that word, but you might. Maybe it's an imported product, maybe it got slipped through the cracks somehow, but partially means trans fat. If you see hydrogenated oil, this is a saturated fat. These are still allowed. You will still see these in food products. A lot of products that used to have trans fats now have saturated fats. So slightly better for us, but not really. So that's something you can look for on the label as well. I have a little donut here. So some other considerations, I will definitely get to questions, but we got a lot of content, so I want to make sure I get through this, but I will get to questions for sure. But some other considerations. So these are ones you may not have thought of as well. So the first one is unfiltered coffee. So I kind of alluded to it up above, but unfiltered coffee can have a significant impact on our LDL cholesterol. Unfiltered coffee contains compounds, the names don't matter, but they can reduce the clearance of LDL in our liver. And for this reason, we really recommend if you struggle with, managing your cholesterol levels and you drink a good amount of coffee that's unfiltered, I recommend filtering it. So some examples of unfiltered coffee would be French press, which is like my favorite, but that is unfiltered, espresso, cold brew. So you can still enjoy these types, but let's say you make your own cold brew or you're buying it. I would still recommend pouring it through a paper filter because that paper filter will filter out those compounds. And if you ever kind of look at, I recommend doing this the next time you make a cup of coffee. If you look at the top of your coffee and you see kind of like an oil slick, that's a lot of those compounds that may increase your cholesterol. It's like a type of oil that's found in that. So certainly I recommend. I had, for very anecdotal quick story, I had a student when I was teaching at a local university. We talked about this in one of our food science classes, and she emailed me months later and said that she switched. She loved French press coffee, but switched to an auto drip that had a paper filter, and she reduced her cholesterol by like 15 points. So she didn't make any other changes. So for a lot of people, I mean, it might not be the only thing, but certainly it could help if you're drinking a lot of unfiltered coffee. And then the other one is added sugar. As I mentioned, it does raise triglyceride levels, but we're starting to find that it can potentially raise LDL and lower HDL. So that's a double whammy right there. And then, of course, increase triglycerides too. So we want to watch out for that added sugar consumption as much as possible in whole, food products. So now, fortunately, as of 2020, which I cannot believe it's been 5 years, but you'll see the added sugar line on food packages, but also how much you're adding to foods in any form, whether it's honey, maple syrup, granulated sugar, agave, brown sugar, they all technically count as added sugar. The recommendation is no more than 24 to 36 grams per day, which is about 6 to 9 teaspoons. But if you're looking at a food package, the added sugar will be listed in grams. So that's why I added that here as well. And you can also grams, so it'll be what I think there's 4 grams per teaspoon. So that's how you get the math there. But so added sugar is another piece. Now, how about cholesterol in foods? I know we're getting close. I only have like 2 more slides. So what about eggs and just cholesterol we get from foods? Now, scientists have long debated the role that dietary cholesterol, so the cholesterol in our food, has an effect on our blood cholesterol. There's a lot of debate. Now, because it's associated with saturated fat, it was always recommended to reduce our dietary cholesterol, especially eggs, because we thought that would help with heart health. But really, again, research is hard in this area because what are people often eating eggs with? Often high saturated fat foods like bacon, sausage, and butter. So it's probably not the eggs, it was more so those foods. So if you were eating eggs with oatmeal, probably not the same research would be showing. Guidelines have recently changed. They used to recommend no more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol per day, but that number was actually recently removed. They recommend not eating a ton and, reducing as much as you can, but a specific number is no longer recommended because it's not necessarily the cholesterol they care about, but it's the saturated fat component. So recommendations still remain to reduce our saturated fat intake because these foods also have cholesterol. Again, it's often an animal food. Animals have livers, they're producing cholesterol. But if they have saturated fat, that's the negative part. But there are foods that are high in cholesterol that are not high in saturated fat. And these are eggs and seafood like shellfish, shrimp, lobster, all that type of stuff. So they don't have very much saturated fat at all, but they have high cholesterol. So we've been finding that those are not negative for our heart health. Some people, like I've said, we're all genetically different. There are still some people who are predisposed to be more sensitive to dietary cholesterol, meaning their blood values may shoot up anyway from dietary cholesterol, but we're learning most people do not. So that's a positive. Seafood, shellfish, and eggs, not as detrimental for our cholesterol as we once thought. Nutrition research in general is always updating, and sometimes it takes a while for it to become mainstream, but I think this is a good thing. Now, what are some practical dietary habits you can do in your daily life to start reducing your cholesterol? Now, the biggest recommendation is, this is overwhelming. It's a lot of stuff. Don't try to change everything at once. That never works for anything. Pick one thing you can do, make it a consistent habit, and then stack on another habit after that. You don't want to try to change everything because then you might not stick with any of them, and that won't be moving you forward. So some recommendations, you could swap some lower fiber starches for higher fiber options, things like brown rice or quinoa, whole grain or bean-based pastas, oat bran, whole grain breads. You could enjoy a fruit or a vegetable as a snack, right? Because we know they're going to have soluble fiber. They might have some plant sterols and stanols. So things like apples with peanut or almond butter, hummus with, I'm going to link these carrot chips I love in our produce department. They're actual carrots just cut into wedges, or whole grain crackers because they'll have fiber too. Replace one sugary beverage with a sparkling water or other type of unsweetened beverage. Filter that coffee. Add ground chia or flaxseed to smoothies, oatmeal, baked goods, whatever you want to do. Opt for baked versus fried foods, especially things like chicken or donuts. You can get baked versions or make your own baked versions of these. Chips, you'll find baked versus fried options, and that'll significantly reduce the saturated fat and trans fats. Cook with things like olive or avocado oil as opposed to butter all the time, and measure how much. It still matters to measure how much you're doing. Try meatless Mondays. Experiment with tofu. We have tons of recipes. Choose leaner meats, so look for the words loin or round. Remove the skin from poultry. Choose 90-10 ground beef or other types of meats. And of course, join our classes and use guiding star rated recipes because more often than not, these are going to follow some of those parameters and cook more meals at home. Of course, if you have not checked out our updated website, certainly go there. We have dietary preferences. One is on heart health, and we have a handout about cholesterol on there. So there's a lot of great options, but definitely check it out if you haven't yet. I have some cholesterol-friendly recipes to share. So the Big Batch Tomato Lentil Stew, I've made this one so many times. One serving has 16 grams of fiber. It is crazy. The blueberry chia overnight oats. So you think like you have the oats, you have the chia, you have blueberries, like there, you have walnuts. Like there are so many components of that recipe. You could add soy milk and just so many options. And then the mason jar noodles with veggies. This has edamame and tofu, and then, tons of great vegetables as well. So fitting it all together. I know this was a lot, we're a little bit over, but consider your, soluble fiber intake, your plant food intake. Are you eating enough? Probably not, because most of us aren't. Choose foods with little to no added sugars, saturated fats or trans fats, and opt to filter that coffee. Dietary cholesterol that we find in low saturated fat foods like eggs and baked shellfish. I put baked because obviously a lot of times shellfish are fried, like, popcorn shrimp. We mean, steamed or sauteed or all of those options. Likely don't have to be limited like we once thought for most people. So that's a good thing. And then, of course, there are other lifestyle factors, things like physical activity, smoking, alcohol consumption, and genetics, of course, that are going to play a big role in cholesterol management. Diet is just one piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, there are more classes coming up in February. Make sure you join us. Oh, it is next week for lowering blood pressure at noon to learn all about how to lower your blood pressure. I'm going to stop sharing and we are going to get to our questions. But thank you so much for joining and learning all about cholesterol. I know it was a lot.